Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first of our special three-part speaker series, marking 2026, the 200th anniversaries of the start of the Rideau Canal and the founding of Bytown. I should mention that our Bytown 200 theme is carrying through in our French language speaker series as well, with our next presentation on March 7th, with a look back at the Bytown era. Through this special series of Bytown 200 speaker series presentations, through the special Bytown 200 story collection we've been building on our website, and through the special Bytown 200 award we'll be presenting to students at this year's Ottawa Regional Heritage Fair in April. It is our goal not only to share stories about Bytown and the Rideau Canal, but also to examine the impact that the establishment of both has had on the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, for whom the Ottawa Valley has been home for millennia. What enormous impacts did settlement have on the lives, livelihoods, and traditions of the Algonquin people? We flooded, diverted, and reshaped along the Rideau watershed as we hurriedly built our canal, obliterating where Algonquin had traditionally fished. We felled the forests of the Ottawa Valley where the Algonquin had traditionally hunted and gathered. Our rush to industrialize rendered one of the most beautiful and sacred of natural features in all of Turtle Island, the Chaudière Falls, unrecognizable and inaccessible. We are today indeed on the unceded, unsurrendered land of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg people. Tonight's presentation will be followed by a Q&A session, during which we will read the questions that you have typed in the chat box. So please get typing those great questions. As always, we look forward to a respectful and constructive dialogue as we explore these important issues. It is our great honor to have Dr. Lynn Gehl as our guest speaker tonight. It has been my pleasure to have had the opportunity to have numerous conversations with Dr. Gehl and to get to know Lynn and her partner Nick these past few months. In fact, the format of tonight's presentation will be a conversation between Lynn and myself. Lynn has cautioned me that not everybody in the Algonquin community sees things the same way, and there are those who may take issue with some of the opinions expressed by Lynn tonight. I think the same could be said when diverse opinions are expressed in any community. To truly examine the past, or the present, or the future, the truth can only be pursued when we are open to welcoming widely varying perspectives. Dr. Gehl is an academic, advocate, author, artist, and member of the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan First Nation. Lynn holds a doctorate of philosophy in Indigenous Studies, a master's degree in Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies, an undergraduate degree in cultural anthropology, and a diploma in chemical technology. Lynn has authored numerous remarkable books, academic journal articles, news pieces, and UN submissions. Lynn, as a public speaker, has been called upon to appear as an expert before parliamentary committees and has received a Governor General's Award. But I won't say too much more because I'll be inviting Lynn to hopefully share her own journey and story with us tonight. So I'm now going to unshare my screen so that everyone can see our smiling faces. Welcome, Lynn. I'll start in with my first question, Lynn.
Can I introduce myself first?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I introduced you. You go ahead and introduce you.
Kwe Makanak Dodem, Kitchisabin Dunjaba, Nagojawan, Megwan Dida, Gizike Te Mandado Kwe Indigenous Cause, and Da Shagana, she knows when Lynn Gehl, and Donis and Da, and she miss and Da, and she goes and Da. Up to go and Doch and then Nam and Anishinaabe Kwe Wayan. Thank you, Ben and Sherry and Jacob. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lynn. So, Lynn, you're a member of the Algonquin Pikwakanagan First Nation, yet your childhood was, to a large extent, spent distant and disconnected from your people. Can you start off by telling us about your early life?
Yes. I decided I wanted to just talk about my great-grandfather Joseph Gagne and great-grandmother Annie Jane Maness. They were both living at Golden Lake when it was called the Golden Lake Reserve. Annie Maness was the daughter of Frank Maness. She was Algonquin, and Joseph Gagne was the daughter of Angeline Jocko and Joseph Gagne. So he was Algonquin through his mother line. And after the war, he actually went to WW1. After the war, he came home and he did live on the Golden Lake Reserve with Annie. They had a shack, according to his veterans records. And he applied for some relief, either in the form of unemployment and pension. He had war wounds, from the war. He had gunshot wounds to his leg and arm, and he had some shrapnel. When he applied for relief, he was instructed to leave the reserve because he was considered not to be an Indian. His Algonquinness came through his mother line, Angeline Jocko. So within a day, he left and he moved to the village of Golden Lake. And eventually he lived in Pembroke, in the city of Pembroke. He moved to a couple times. And I don't know much about my father's life, but recently, reading the veteran records that I received, there was a period of time where my father was a toddler and he was living with Joseph. And then but my father did live in that area of the traditional territory, and he fished out of the lakes. He was a fisherman. And my mother is from Saint Eustache, Montreal, and she attended residential school. So they met up and they they had 8 children. They lived in Toronto. I'm the fifth of eighth child of the 8 children, and we lived in project housing. So we essentially were. My great grandfather was relocated out of his reserve, and then we relocated out of our territory. And we lived in around a 1,000 square foot flat, all 10 of us, in it was like an apartment, I guess, or a maisonette. Of course, what do I want to say? They didn't stay married. My parents didn't stay married for some reasons that I don't really talk about much. Um, and so it was just my mother and the 8 kids. We had food insecurity and home insecurity. Eventually, what happened is this particular project that we lived in. It was late and it became a drug portal. It was a drug portal, and there's all kinds of horrible things going on. So they actually relocated us. It was another forced relocation. So I share that knowledge because I think a lot of people assume I come from a place of privilege, and they assume that I don't have the embodied knowledge of colonization. But that would be incorrect. I have worked really hard to get a PhD. I wasn't finished my PhD until my late 40s. If I lived with privilege, I would have had that done in my late 20s. And another thing that I share with people is that I have a vision disability because of a cranial nerve issue, and as a toddler, I endured three surgeries, which were complete failures. So now I have some vision issues. Reading and writing was very hard, not only because of the vision disability, but because survival for me didn't require reading and writing. Survival was more about scavenging for safety and comfort. So I think that's about it. Eventually, I did go to university, though. So I think
Well,
the next.
exactly. I mean, today you're a foremost Indigenous scholar. Yet you also point out that you did not actually learn to read and write confidently until adulthood. What you went on to achieve is remarkable. Can you talk about what directed you to pursue a university education and take us through a bit of your academic journey?
Sure, but some people would say I can't read even today. Reading is a burden, but I do a lot of reading. I'm quite proud of my Algonquin library. I like to brag and say I think it's the biggest one that exists. Um, so what directed me? Well, when your father dies as a homeless person, killed by a train, and you experience your mother not being able to feed her children, you life doesn't make much sense, right? Life just does not make much sense. It's not like in the on the television show, for example, or Leave It to Beaver. Um, but what happened was eventually when I was 30, I met Nick. And I kind of said I'd like to quit my job, and he didn't really want me to quit. But I guess moaned enough, pissed and moaned, and he said, "Well, you better quit." So I resigned from my job at the I was working for the provincial government. I was involved with water technology, monitoring Canada's waterways for pollutants like dioxins and PCBs, for example, the kind of things that pulp and paper mills dump into the water. And I worked in that position for about 12 years, but I wasn't happy there. I don't do well in institutional power. And so I had a desire to understand what happened to, what happened to the Algonquin people, what happened to my family, what's going on. So I started in psychology. I was took one course because my reading level was so poor, and I did really well in that course. And then I took two at a time, and then I take one in the summer, and eventually. I switched my major from psychology to anthropology because psychology I realized was just another science and it wasn't answering my questions. And so when I went into anthropology, I had like a huge mind shift. I realized that there's multiple ways to be a human being and they're all legitimate. And it was a critical thinking, anthropology is a critical thinking discipline. And so I realized that it was systems of power that did that to the Algonquin people and did that to my family. So I was really happy to have that opportunity to learn about that there's multiple ways to be a human being, that the issue of my poverty wasn't because I was trash, for example. And after I was finished with that, I decided to go and do a master's in Canadian studies and Native studies, but don't ask me much about Canadian studies. And my topic was I wanted to look at identity because Indigenous identity was so it's such a political issue. It still is a political issue with all the pretendians. And what I did is I looked at what's known as three essentialized definitions of identity. I looked at blood quantum, phenotype physiology, and Indian Act status. Phenotype physiology speaks to, people are Indigenous if they look Indigenous, and blood quantum, it was a common thing to do to think one quarter blood was made you an Indigenous person. At one time, that was even part of the Indian Act. And status registration. So I looked at those three things. So it meant I really just examined them through the literature and did some good thinking about them. And I talked about how when people don't feel aren't able to fulfill those criteria, those definitions of identity, they suffer spiritually. They're quite disenfranchised. Some people, like imagine being a blue-eyed, blonde-haired Indian. My father was pretty fair, so he had difficulty claiming who he was as an Indigenous person. For example. So I was really happy to learn that, but I was situated within Gale versus Canada, and that was it started in 1985. And so again, I was still just learning how to read and write and think. But then I had the opportunity to do it. Well, I didn't have the opportunity. I applied to do a PhD, and I had to switch my topic completely, which is the nature, I think, of my approach to knowledge, an Indigenous approach to knowledge. I realized I had to look at the land claim and self-government process that the Algonquins were in. I didn't understand the history of the treaty process. I didn't understand the land claim process. I didn't understand the difference between them. I didn't understand if they were a good process. So I completely switched my topic at the PhD level and did the Algonquin land claim process. Um, and I completed that task. I think it was in 2010. And I wrote a book. My dissertation was converted into a book, The Truth that Wampum Tells. It was a brutal learning exercise, though, for me, because most people when they complete a PhD, they get a happy product at the end. They're happy they found something, discovered something. But for me, it was quite brutal because I realized that Canada's colonial period wasn't over. That Canada was continuing to commit genocide against Indigenous people, and in particular the Algonquin people.
You mentioned Lynn versus Gehl versus Canada. And Lynn, it's been a true pleasure getting to know you these last few months. But one thing is clear, you're a very determined person. And I think there's no greater evidence of that than your decades-long effort in pursuing Gehl versus Canada and the key issue of unknown and unstated paternity in the Indian Act. Can you tell us a bit more about that important effort, Lynn?
Yes. It was about 30 years of my life. And I really had no power. The Department of Justice, the biggest law firm in Canada, had all the power. They have I think it's a staff of over 600 people, or I don't know. No, I think their budget is 6 million or something, or billion. Anyways, I'll catch my breath. Um, so what happened was in 1985, they amended the Indian Act, and I was kind of like, wow, they amended that Indian Act. They got rid of that sex discrimination. So possibly my father and my grandmother, my father, and myself would be entitled to get to become status Indians and become a member of Pikwakanagan. Um, but that didn't happen so easily. I only won, I think I won it, I think 2017. So I'll just have some notes here and I'll go by that. So what happened is in 1985, instead of ending all the sex discrimination, Canada actually created new forms of sex discrimination. They created the second generation cutoff rule, and they removed a provision that protected children of unknown and unstated paternity. So, and it was really annoying for me because the argument was that they amended the Indian Act to bring it in line with the Charter, and it was a blatant lie. And the world wasn't making sense to me anyway. So that was another thing. Like, what's going on here? The world's not making any sense. So I was struggling still at that time. In 1985, I was whatever, only 23 years old. So I hadn't come out of the shadow of the trauma and the horrible thing that Canada did to my family. Are still actually living it, and as a matter of fact, I still live it. So I approached Aboriginal Legal Services of Toronto and asked them if they would take my case, and they said yes, they would. And so I was so ignorant. I remember saying to my lawyer, "Well, who is their lawyer?" And my lawyer said, "It's the biggest law firm in Canada, Lynn. It's the Department of Justice. They have 4,600 staffers and a budget of $662 million. And then there was me, and I didn't even know who the lawyer was. That's how ignorant I was. So, anyways, what ended up happening was that my first statement of claim was struck, and then we filed a statement of claim again. And eventually, my grandmother was instated as the 6'2", but that wasn't a strong enough status to give it to my father. So I had to research my great grandfather, Joseph Gagne, to prove that he was entitled to status through his mother, Angeline Jocko. And I proved that through archival research. So I learned how to do archival research. As a person with a vision disability, I was overstressed, I would say. But I did find the document that proved that Joseph Gagne was entitled to status in his own right. So then my grandmother was updated to a 6'1", or upgraded to a 6'1" status, and that meant my father was entitled. The problem my father doesn't know who his father was. It was an situation of unknown and unstated paternity. But what the Indian Affairs did is they assumed that the man was a white man, and that meant I wasn't entitled. So of course I knew that was sex discrimination, and so I pursued it. And um, as I said, my first statement of claim was struck in 2001, and then it was filed again. And in this process, I was completing my master's and my PhD, and I was journeying through what I'm going to call a maze of jurisdictional rules, not really even understanding them. In 2012, my case was actually dismissed because it just wasn't moving forward. And then there was actually finally in 2014 there was a hearing in the Ontario Superior Court, and but I lost. A really poor reasoning too. The judge was reasoning so poor, and the reasoning she used was because my brother's application was treated the same way as my application. There was no sex discrimination, which is ridiculous because I was being discriminated, and so was my brother on the issue of unknown and unstated paternity. So the reasoning, if in my opinion, was really poor. So we filed a statement of an appeal. I guess there was errors of law, and we managed to go to the Ontario Court of Appeal. And eventually in 2017, I won. But in that, it was a kind of a poor win because the judge decided I was only entitled to 6-2 status, which is a weaker form of status. And so, the discrimination just kept coming and coming. 30 years later, they're still discriminating against me. Fortunately, at the time, Sharon McIver was at the United Nations level, and we were all rallying around the 6-1A all the way clause, which means that the descendants of women, the descendants of women who were enfranchised should be treated the same as the men who remain status. And Sharon won on that case, so I was upgraded to a 6-1A, and that meant my nieces and nephews were now entitled. They are entitled, and in one situation, my niece, even her children are entitled. So it was a 34-year journey, from 1985 was 34 years, and in that process, I got an undergrad, a master's, and a PhD. But if you go back and you think about my great grandmother, she wrote a letter in 1945. This is after her husband died. She wanted to know if she was accounted as an Indian. Her name was Anne Jane Maness, and her husband was the WW1 veteran. In 1945, she asked if she was counted as an Indian, and they told her no, she was now a white woman. So for her, that was 75 years. So you can and my great grandfather. So you can see that it was more an intergenerational effort. Um, my father was eventually deemed entitled, but he was already deceased. He died in 1988 as a homeless person. Now, that would have changed his life to be registered and to be a voting member of the band. So I wrote a book about it. It's Gehl versus Canada.
That's what I was about to say. People look at the poster, they can see that Gehl versus Canada is one of the books. And I have to say that I have not completely read your 5 books, but I'm more than halfway through. And the reason it's taking me a long time is your books are so thought-provoking. You write extensively about Indigenous knowledge and the Debwe journey methodology you developed. And it's taken me time to wrap my head around all that. I was wondering if you might mind taking some time tonight to walk us through these concepts of Indigenous knowledge and of the Debwe journey.
Yes. So, conceptual thinking it still isn't easy for me to do. Because as a child, I was essentially scavenging for survival, for physical existence. So, thinking conceptually and theoretically wasn't important, and I certainly wasn't taught that. I wasn't taught anything about the war either. So moving into Indigenous knowledge was, again, another moment where my cognition kind of exploded. People can be living Indigenous knowledge in practice, but not really understand it in a mindful way, which is interesting to think about. So when I was completing my PhD in Indigenous studies, I decided that, well, I'm in Indigenous studies. I don't want to do history, and I don't want to do interviews, and I want to do Indigenous knowledge, and I want to do it through Indigenous ways of knowing and being. I didn't know what they were, but that's what I wanted to do. And so in Indigenous studies, I was being exposed to a lot of teachings. All the literature was Indigenous knowledge. It wasn't history, for example. We were attending ceremonies and talking to elders and going to even like elder conferences, getting as much exposure to Indigenous knowledge as you can, learning the language part, that was part of the program. Um, and there was a lot of discussion about heart knowledge. And I thought, well, that's quaint. It's so quaint. But I didn't think I thought, I'm not touching that. I said, there's no way I'm going there. I wanted my knowledge to be appreciated as valid and legitimate. And I felt like talking about hard knowledge would be dismissed as women's knowledge. But as I kept on listening to the elders and the teachings and the language, I realized that heart knowledge is quite sophisticated. And actually, one of the teachings that I received was from an elder who I won't name because they recently passed. And she said that when we talk to one another, Ben, we look at each other. And the reason we look at each other is so that we can read each other's faces and emotions. So when you're sad, I'm sad. When I'm happy, you're happy. When you're angry, I'm angry. And there's a physiological synchronization between us, and that's through reading each other's faces. And that's how you know truth, and that's how you embody truth. And I went, wow, that's really powerful, right? Thing. It's not trivial and it's not silly. And then another teaching I was exposed to was a Debwaywen Mikanchichigawing. It was an ancient scroll. Indigenous people had ancient forms of symbolic literacy, such as scrolls and petroglyphs and petrographs and wapen diplomacy and smoke signals. That's my favorite. And so I had this opportunity to listen to Rennie Gaywish talk, who's a Medeawan person. And she talked about this ancient scroll talk that is the circle of mind knowledge and the circle of heart knowledge, two circles coming together. And when those two circles come together, then you have a truth. And when she told that knowledge, when she taught that knowledge or said that knowledge, I was like, uh, I walked out of the room. That's all I could think about, how profound that was. I had a fascination with, I still have a fascination with symbolic literacy and ancient symbolic forms. And so I went out, I walked out and I went, that's going to be my methodology, Debwaywen Mikanchichigawing, which I changed to Debwaywen Journey. So the theory, the methodological theory is this idea that a truth doesn't exist unless both the mind knowledge and the heart knowledge exists. So if you may have the embodied heart knowledge, but if you don't have the reasoned knowledge, there's no truth there. You may have the reasoned knowledge, but not the heart knowledge. That means there's no truth there. So it goes both ways. And a traditional teaching is that the longest journey is that between your heart and your head. So I decided, well, that's going to be my methodological theory. I'm going to have to write it out though. And then my methods and practices that were introspection, reading the literature, experience. I was experiencing the land claim process, observations, and heart knowledge itself. And so my methodology, again, was this idea that truth is not there unless there's mind knowledge and heart knowledge. And then under that, so through that Debwaywen Mikan Chichigawing, which again I changed to Debwaywen Journey, I completed my research on the Algonquin land claim and self-government process. And you can see that in my chapters, they're organized around that way. Each chapter starts with a heart story, and then questions, and then reading the literature, then introspection. And there is a repetition there, which could annoy a lot of people. But what is introspection if it's not repetition? So that was my methodology, and I'm really proud of the Boywin Journey Me Come to Chigwing. I think it's the most profound thing I'll ever produce as a thinker, as a scholar, and it was published in an international journal, Alternative, and it's also republished in Claiming Anishinaabe. Really, really special article, but it requires some conceptual thinking, which some people might struggle with.
If people like books that make them think, I highly recommend your books. And I believe, Lynn, if they visit your website, they can get information on how to get hold of them. I definitely recommend them. Lynn, as I've mentioned earlier, tonight's conversation is part of a three-part speaker series marking 2026, the bicentennial of the beginning of the Rideau Canal, the beginning of Bytown. and that we also feel that it's crucial to talk about the impact that the establishment of both have had on the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. Yet the story starts much earlier than the arrival of Colonel By in the beginning of the Rideau Canal in Bytown. Can you tell us something about Algonquin contact and pre-contact history?
Yes. So, you know, as a child learning about Canada's history, this idea of, French and British benevolent people, founders of Canada, I just hated that story. Um,
What story would you have told?
it was very difficult though, because, grade 9 history is compulsory and you have to listen to that nonsense of the French and the British being the benevolent founders. So of course I know that that's not true. Um, and that continues today, actually. So first of all, I'd like to say that Algonquin territory is about 200,000 square kilometers, and that's larger than Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick combined. And that's really important to know that and understand that, because those provinces have jurisdiction of their land and resources, yet the Algonquins do not. And I want to thank Dr. Veldon Coburn for reminding me about that factoid. So, as most people know, it was in 1613 when Samuel de Champlain traveled up the Ottawa River, and as he was going up, he recorded us in his journals. It's the Whiskerini, the Metawiskerini, and the Kississippirini, and a couple other names that I don't want to butcher. And he encountered Chief Tessawat, who had jurisdiction of the Ottawa River, and he would charge a toll. So Algonquin people did have an economy. He would charge a toll for the people to move past the islands of Allumette Island, Calumet Island, and Morrison Island. Um, but unfortunately, during the fur trade, the Mohawk people moved into our territory, and the island Algonquin and some of the Nipissings they relocated to Oka. But they didn't, all the Algonquins did not relocate. According to the literature, many of the Algonquins stayed on the tributaries, both in what is now Quebec and in Ontario. Um, so it's in some ways it's good to think of there's island Algonquin and there's inland Algonquin, and so um, I think that's really important. I want to stress that that's really, really important about that we were in Champlain's journals, that we are clearly recorded there. And during the French and Indian War, which is also known as the Seven-Year War between the French and the British, the British approached the Seven Nations of Canada, and asked us to move into a neutral position. Well, they took the French at Montreal. And the Seven Nations of Canada agreed to do that on the grounds that they would protect their land. Um, and the British won. And somehow they got they got Algonquin land. Somehow the French relinquished Algonquin land, land that is not theirs. Um, and I think two important dates was that the in 1760 at Oswegatchie, that's where the promise was made that the British would protect the Seven Nations of Canada land, and then it was formalized into a treaty in 1760 at the Treaty of Kanawaki. And I have to thank Russell Diabo for that clarity, that recent clarity. Unfortunately, as we all know, the British reneged on that deal. And what they ended up doing was they took a narrow interpretation as meaning the mission settlements. So after the British defeated the French, they had a lot of personalities to deal with. They had the Indigenous nations and they had the French themselves, and they crafted the 1763 Royal Proclamation defining the new province of Quebec and a large hunting territory. Now, the Royal Proclamation has always baffled me for many reasons. First of all, because part of our territory was now under control of the British, and it was called Quebec. The 45th parallel cut through Algonquin territory below the Ottawa River. I always thought that was weird. Why did they do that? And I realize now that it was so the British could control the economy coming through that river. And then below that line, that 45th parallel, they opened it to Indian hunting territory for all nations, for all people. So I think I've really struggled with understanding that. I've really struggled with the fact that a lot of Indigenous people say that the Royal Proclamation is the Magna Carta of Indigenous rights, and I always thought, well, I don't get it. Algonquins don't have a treaty. I never had a right in my life as an Algonquin. So I really struggled in understanding all the contradictions, all the nonsense. And even to hear people talking about being a treaty Indian, that one kind of baffled me because we didn't have a treaty. Parliament was on our land, for example. And they didn't pay for that land. So what I also want to say, because there's a lot of discussion and debate about, who about Algonquin territory. So I'd like to say that in 1761, Alexander Henry, while traveling up the Ottawa River, he encountered Algonquins and Nipissing, and they defined their territories encompassing all the lands north and south of the Ottawa River as far as Lake Nipissing. That was in 1761. So that was even before the Royal Proclamation. And also, it's important to understand that the Algonquins, their earliest written petition, was in 1772, and I think there's like 28 oral speeches and petitions beginning in 1772, right up to 1983. So we have a consistent century-long claim to that territory. Interestingly enough, and I just learned this recently, I've been fortunate in the last few years to spend time just learning about Algonquin history, and because it was weak. And I was struck by Treaty 9, how Treaty 9, it divided an Algonquin community whose territory transcended the Ontario and Quebec border. So they were split into two in Treaty 9. So now they're Abitibiwini and Washigo. And it was argued that at that time, the French wouldn't allow the treaty to happen in Quebec because they still claimed the land through the doctrine of discovery, which I don't understand. I thought they relinquished the land. I thought they lost that war. But that's an interesting example of what they did to that community. They split them where one part of the community, the one in Ontario, is part of Treaty 9, but the other part of the community, Abitibiwini, which is in Quebec, they're not part of Treaty 9. So a lot of people think that there's only one federally recognized Algonquin reserve, and there's actually two, Pikwakanagan and Washigo. I think I'm saying that correctly. So the other thing I think is really important, and this was a hard lesson for me to learn, was that most often people think that the reserves were created through the treaty process. And that is true in terms of the Robinson-Huron and the numbered treaties and the 1923 Williams Treaty. But on the other side of the Rockies, that's not true. And in Quebec, that's not true. And in the eastern provinces, that's not true. The reserves were created in other ways. And so, for example, in Quebec, Kitigan-Zibi and Temiskaming were created through legislation. And today there's actually 9 Algonquin First Nations in Quebec, and some of them don't even have reserve lands, and some of them don't even have electricity or running water. So in total, there's 2 Algonquin First Nations in Ontario, and there's 9 Algonquin First Nations in Quebec, federally recognized though, but there's actually some unrecognized Algonquin collectives in Ontario. And another thing I'd like to say is what happened with the Algonquin territory in Ontario was it was treated away by the Mississauga people through the 1783 Crawford Purchase and the 1819 Rideau Purchase and the 1923 Williams Treaty. treaty. So they were treated by the wrong person. That's exactly what I'm saying. Um, and there are government officials such as James Hughes and A.E. St. Louis who investigated the various competing claims for the Ottawa River, and they concluded that much of the territory was ceded by the wrong nation. It belonged to the Algonquin and Nipissing, but the Mississauga were allowed to cede it. And there's, of course, a lot of people like to disagree with myself about that, but the evidence is there. Champlain recorded us in the Ottawa River. Alexander Henry has his reports, and so I think the evidence is there that, and certainly, unfortunately, this is a bizarre thing to say, but Ontario and Canada wouldn't be sitting at a table with the Algonquins of Ontario if they had a weak claim to the land. So we need to really just end that debate. I won't do it anymore. Um, so what I want to say is, in Quebec, we lost our land to the French. In Ontario, we lost it through the Mississauga people, ceding our land. And in the islands, we also had, as I said, jurisdiction of the islands, and we also lost that as well through it began in 1839. An order in council took our right to lease the islands. We were leasing the islands. We needed to enter into the economy, the cash economy. We were leasing the islands, but that right was taken away from us. So we lost the land in Quebec, lost the land in Ontario, and we also lost the islands. And our sacred place. So the other thing I want to say was that Parliament Hill was built on Garrison Hill, which is Algonquin territory, and at the time it was estimated to be worth $1.1 million. They never bought that land. They never paid for that, right? They stole it, fair and square, if I can say that. It was a genocide. So there's various legislations and policies that also took the Algonquin land away. A lot of people think the Algonquin sat around and let it all happen. We did not, obviously. It was a genocide. So, for example, there was the 1853 Public Lands Act, which provided free land to settlers, but not to the Algonquin. Um, and again, the 1868 Free Grants and Homestead Act, again, it was our Algonquin land was given to settlers, but not the Algonquins. And in 1890, there was they taxed wildlands, if you can believe it. So Algonquin people who were still hunting and trapping lost their trap lines because they didn't have tax dollars to pay their they didn't have dollars to pay their tax bills. But it gets even worse. As I'm learning more about my great-grandfather, Joseph Gagne, who was in WW1 through the 1917 Soldier Settlement Act, returning veterans they were allowed the benefits of land, 160 acres of land for farming, some farming implements, and some financial aids. But the Algonquin veterans were denied, such as my great-grandfather, Joseph Gagne, who in the end was buried in a pauper's grave without a gravestone.
So today, there are the 9 reserves on the Quebec side, the one on the Ontario side. So that's where the Algonquin First Nations are located today?
Yes, there's 9 of them in Quebec. Well, what is Quebec? And there's 2 in Ontario. But if you read the petitions and you read the Joan Holmes report, you eventually learn that there was 3 unrecognized communities. The Canada or the British promised that they would make reserves for them, but didn't come through. And so in Ontario, we have not only do we have non-status Algonquin, we have unrecognized Algonquins. They are around the Charbot Lake, Ardoch area, Baptiste Lake, and the Mattawa area, and Lawrence, Nightingale, and Sabine. So there's actually 4. I'm just looking at a map that I made to help me remember. So there's 4 unrecognized collectives, and that's why at the Algonquins of Ontario land claim process, of course, these non-status and unrecognized Algonquins have to be a part of the process, right? Canada and Ontario are not going to proceed on a land claim that again denies Algonquin people because they want this over and done with. They don't want to have to come back and visit this in 50 years and to a collective of unrecognized non-status Algonquins and say you forgot us. So.
So, do the Algonquin, in fact, have any land treaties? Tell us about the 1764 Treaty at Niagara.
Yeah, so no, we don't have any land treaties. I don't know how that happened. I mean, if Champlain recorded us in the 1600s and Parliament Hill's on our land, how does that even happen? I think that's part of the British plan, part of the French plan to deny who we are. So we don't have any land treaties, but other nations such as the Mississauga, they do have treaties that ceded our land, such as the Rideau Purchase and the Crawford Purchase and the 1923 Williams Treaty, which goes all the way up to the Ottawa River. But no, the Algonquins don't have any land treaties. So the treaty, but they were involved in peace treaties. One important one was the 1760 Treaty of Niagara. And I spent a lot of time learning about the treaty at Niagara, 1764 Treaty at Niagara. And so it was a peace treaty. The British wanted to bring together all their Indigenous allies, the Western Great Lakes Confederacy, and which included at this time Anishinaabe people and Haudenosaunee people. And what can I say about that? I really like John Burroughs' discussion about the Treaty at Niagara. He talks about that was where the Royal Proclamation of 1763 was ratified. And the Royal Proclamation is part of Canada's Constitution, and he makes the argument if the Royal Proclamation is a part of Canada's Constitution, then so should the three wampum belts that were exchanged. Wampum belt diplomacy is an ancient way of codifying knowledge, which is really fascinating and special. So the Royal Proclamation, what a lot of people don't know if you read it, which is hard for me to read, it speaks in forked tongue. Our ancestors talk about forked tongue, and indeed that's what the British did with the Royal Proclamation. If you read it, it calls us nations, but it also calls us subjects, which is terrible. So the idea of the Treaty at Niagara was to bring together the nations and to enter into a new relationship, a covenant chain relationship that would require polishing over time. And there was 24 nations there that attended at Niagara, and there was again three wampum belts that were exchanged. Some people debate that though. So the William Johnson, he gave the Indigenous nation the Western Great Lakes and British Covenant Chain Wampum Belt, and the 24 nations belt. There's apparently 24 nations there, like the Mississauga, I say them first, isn't that funny? Algonquin, Nipissing, the Ojibwa, and the Six Nations were there, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Oneida. So there's 27 in total. Even the Wendat were there, or 24 in total. Even the Wendat were there. So, and then, and that belt, the 24 Nations belt, it codified this idea that if the British forgot their promises, we were to tug on the rope and remind the British of their promises that they made. And John Burroughs talks about two-row wampum belt was given. We gave the William Johnson the two-row wampum belt. So if you want to understand or you want to decipher the contradiction in the Royal Proclamation that says that we're nations, but we're also subjects, you have to understand and read the wampum belts, which does not codify this idea that we were subjects. We were allies of equal importance, equal significance. Um, eh, that's John Burroughs' argument that you have to read the wampum belts that were exchanged. Now, I made new editions of the wampum belts. I really during my PhD process. It takes me about an hour to read those belts, so I won't read them. I won't read them today. Um, Let me just see what else I have here in case I forgot something. So those wampum belts, they live in our minds and our hearts. We don't know where the physical belts are. They made their way to the two belts made their way to Manitoulin Island, but we're not sure if they burnt in a fire or if they were buried with the last holder of those belts. But what we do have is we have a drawing of the belts from Paul Kane. And so I made new editions of those wampum belts based on that drawing by Paul Kane, but also because there's still wampum belts that are in existence that are using the same symbols and icons. I didn't use wampum beads to make mine. I used seed, I can't remember, they're like a glass bead. So, and I call them new editions. And the reason I call them new editions versus reproduction is because, for example, we wouldn't call a Bible a reproduction. I call them new editions because the knowledge exists and it's real. It's not a reproduction feeling. How I feel about Algonquin territory and our right to Algonquin territory, it exists in my mind and heart, and my heart is real. And so I wouldn't call that a reproduction. And a lot of people would call belts indigenous material items as artifacts, and that's offensive, right? They're not artifacts. They're important cultural items.
I see behind you beautiful wampum belts that you have lovingly crafted. Can you just clarify what is the significance of the wampum belt in the Indigenous culture, so we can all understand?
Sure. So the way I talk about wampum belts is that they're a form of symbolic literacy. A lot of people say that we didn't have a writing system, and we in fact did have a writing system. So they're a form of symbolic literacy, just like words on a page. It's symbolic literacy. Um, uh, and we had other forms of symbolic literacy, that we had birch bark scrolls, petroglyphs, petroforms, smoke signals, notch sticks, so painted hides. We had a lot of forms of symbolic literacy. The difference being was our symbolic literacy didn't exist at the center. It existed more on the outside, and the oral tradition sat in the center. And what you said had weight. So some people would call them mnemonic devices. I actually don't like to call it that. Other people have different names for wampum diplomacy. The other thing I want to say about wampum diplomacy is, well, actually, a couple of things. Most people think that only the Haudenosaunee had wampum diplomacy, and that's not true. The Wendat had them. The Algonquin had them. As a matter of fact, William Commanda was the last holder of three wampum belts. But all along the eastern seaboard, the indigenous nations had wampum belts. It wasn't just a Haudenosaunee thing. Algonquin people had it. And the other thing I want to say about wampum belts is a lot of people think they're frozen in time, and they're not frozen in time. Wampum belt diplomacy, the construction of wampum belts was quite fluid. Sometimes they used clay beads. Sometimes they used uh, seed beads even today, shell beads. There's even been wampum belts with rosary beads in it. So wampum belt diplomacy and the construction is fluid. It's not something that is static and essential in something that's just in the past.
Thank you, Lynn. So you've talked about there being a significant difference between what Canada calls the modern treaty process and the land claims process. So why is that important to understand?
Crucial. Very crucial. Thanks you. So this is the hardest thing that I had to learn when I was doing my PhD. Uh, what is a modern treaty process? What is a land claim? I was walking around asking that all the time, and of course, nobody would tell me. And those were good teachers, you know. The chiefs, politicians wouldn't answer those questions because they're not teachers, they're politicians. Um, in some ways, you can look at it as forked tongue. It really is a continuation of forked tongue discourse. Canada talks about the modern treaty process, and it isn't. It's a land claim process. A treaty process is about sharing the land and resources in equal, equitable ways. A land claim process is about extinguishing Indigenous rights. So you have to really get your mind around that. Whenever you hear Canada talk about the modern treaty process, you need to remember what Lynn Gehl said. It's a land claim process that forces us to extinguish our land and resources. Now, Lynn Gehl's not telling lies. You can believe Lynn Gehl. She's not making it up. Not only did I learn that through my PhD research, if you look at the Algonquin land claim process, they're only offering us 1.7% of our territory and a one-time buyout of $800 million. Now, a nation is not a nation when they only have 1.7% of their territory. And a nation is not a nation when they can't have access to their resources for the long term. And we need to keep in mind that $800 million, you know how much Canada spent on Canada Day of 150? They spent over $500 million. So I think people need to start thinking critically about what is Canada. And it's not a modern treaty process. It's a land claim process. Unfortunately, Algonquin politicians are a little bit reluctant to say things like that because I don't know why. I guess they want to get a vote or they don't want to lose a vote, but I will. I'm not tangled in that.
So let's touch on the Algonquins of Ontario. So when one sees there's an organization called the Algonquins of Ontario, one might naturally assume that this group speaks on behalf of all Algonquin people. Apparently, that's not necessarily how everyone sees it. Can you tell us about the Algonquins of Ontario and the 2016 Agreement in Principle?
Yeah, so as I said, I did my PhD on the Algonquin land claim process, and people can read about from an insider perspective, which has never been done before. They can read some of the gory details of the corruption of power in the land claim process. So, when Canada accepted the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan land claim in the 1990s. Eventually, Canada and Ontario said, you got to go find the non-status and unrecognized, And the people of Pikwakanagan weren't really interested too much because the second generation cutoff rule wasn't hitting them too hard. And also, anyway, I just lost my train of thought on that one. Thank you. But they weren't really interested in broadening the eligibility criteria, and they were actually suggesting a 1/4 blood quantum. At the time, I knew that was never going to fly. It was racist, and it was going to be a matter of time when Pikwakanagan members caught up to them, and it would be when the second generation cutoff rule hit them. And so eventually, what ended up happening was eligibility for Algonquinness in terms of the Algonquin land claim process came down to descent only. And it's based on certain ancestors and other criteria of living in the territory. So when the AIP was ratified, there was 7,500, I'm going to say more than 7,500 eligible voters. But there was less than half of the people voted, only 47%, which is a poor turnout. And Pikwakanagan members wanted their own private vote. And through that process, we learned that the Pikwakanagan members voted against the AIP. So the larger AOO voters, they were in favor of the AIP, but Pikwakanagan members were not. But because the ratification criteria was so holy, HOLEY, versus holy, HOLY, the chief and council went ahead and signed the AIP anyways. And a few days later, or the same day, Carolyn Bennett, let me roll my eyes a couple times over that. She celebrated it as a great moment, yet Pikwakanagan members voted against it and mandated their chief and council to get away from it. But Sorry, go ahead.
Carol Bennett was the federal minister.
Yeah, she was
Yeah.
celebrating it. Pretty ignorant lady. She like a lot of liberals and conservatives. But what makes this process even more pitiful was that we recently had a tribunal that removed, 2,000 non-Algonquin slash pretendians. So these people had the ability to vote on our AIP. So it just gets worse and worse and worse.
So you've mentioned pretendians a few times this evening, and you're talking about people guilty of Indigenous identity fraud. And these are not Indigenous people. I've seen how upsetting it is when people like Thomas King or faculty members of universities are shown to misrepresent themselves as Indigenous. Can you talk about how harmful that is, for example, in reference to the 2016 Agreement in Principle, and also in terms of research and knowledge production that shapes policy and legislation?
Yes, it's when I was doing my dissertation and I was walking around the territory or driving around the territory, um, trying to understand the land claim and self-government process from the inside, I observed and experienced a lot of really bizarre things going on in the Ardoch area, in the Charlotte Lake area, and I just couldn't make any sense of it. Um, and in terms of one of the collectives in Greater Golden Lake, I experienced some really bizarre things there as well. Um, in 2013, I think it's 700 people were removed from the Charlotte Lake Ardoch area as Algonquins. So that's quite a number, 750, I think it was. And that was in 2013. So that was pretty early on. And then more recently, as I said, in 2023, we had a tribunal that removed 2,000 people. And apparently 1,000 of the people were enrolled through a fraudulent document. CBC did an intense analysis of that document. Um, and in 2019, Pikwakanagan chief mentioned that 2,500 people had been removed, and I assumed that 750 from Charlotte Lake area were included in that number. So I needed to have some kind of a number to grasp, and I think Algonquin people needed to have some number to grasp to say, look at these 4,500 people have been shaping our land claim process and corrupting our land claim process. So I did an analysis of that, and that's what I came up with. But I know that there's probably more non-Algonquin slash pretendians involved in the land claim process, and we'll see what happens with that in the future. In terms of knowledge production, well, see, a lot of these pretendians are coming out of universities. And professors in universities, they have a lot of power. They shape research, they shape knowledge, they decide who gets a scholarship, they decide who gets research dollars, large research dollars. And so pretendians are really harming Indigenous people in terms of, if Indigenous people need a better world, we don't need white pretendians shaping that better world. Just like white women wouldn't tolerate white men shaping the research. Why should Algonquins tolerate Algonquin pretendians shaping the outcome of our land claim, the outcome of research, for example? It's a horrible thing. I want a better life, and I don't need white women who are not Algonquin thinking that they're best equipped to shape the knowledge and the research, to deal with issues of ethics, for example. If you pass ethics review, I don't need a pretendian telling me what to do, and I don't need I just didn't need it. I have a lot of bad experiences with pretendians, and I'm not alone in that. There's a couple of women, when you talk to them and they're outspoken about the issue of pretendium, they talk about the hate that they receive. They receive a lot of hate from white women, for example, white men, for example, and they're not doing anything wrong. They're protecting their nation, and they should be allowed to protect their nation, and they should be allowed to shape the research and knowledge of our life.
You've said that the work of weeding out the pretendians has fallen to the Indigenous people, when really it should be the non-Indigenous people who take the lead in weeding out the frauds.
Exactly. And the people, white people ask me, why is that happening? And I get mad at them. I say, go figure it out. It's your government and they're white just like you. You go address it. We have to address issues of disability, issues of insecure housing, issues of poor nutrition, issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women. The last thing we need to do is deal with white pretendians.
So, Lynn, you've made me better understand the term intersectional oppression. Can you finish off by talking about the important work you've been doing regarding Indigenous women and girls with disabilities?
Sure, I'll be short on this one. What a lot of people don't realize is when you're discriminated by sex, race, and disability, your life is extra miserable. Just like if you're taking three different drugs, they could interact and kill you. Being oppressed by three different layers of structural oppression, it can kill you, and it does kill us. So I like to raise awareness about that. Indigenous people, unfortunately, have a lot higher rate of disability. A lot of people think that's because Indigenous people, our body is inferior. No, it's not because our body is inferior. It's because we lack housing, we lack nutrition, because we're targets of sexual violence, sexual abuse. And I'd like to say that Indigenous women and girls with disabilities are bigger targets of sexual violence, even in their hospital bed.
So, Lynn, I think you'd like me to share some images at this point.
Sure, sure. Miigwech. I like all those hearts coming. Please keep them
I
coming.
noticed that.
Yeah, heart knowledge. Thank you, people. I really appreciate it.
So this was the first image that you given
Yeah.
us.
Yeah, so this is a map that Pamela Schreiner and I have been working on about Algonquin territory, and it's just I just like it. The star here shows Acapulco, our sacred place. The red squares show federally recognized First Nations, and the red without a filling is those are reserves without land, if you can believe it. They're leasing land, or so Long Point, Wolf Lake, they don't have their own land base, and even Kick. Um, and I think down here these kind of ovals they represent the unrecognized Algonquin people, the people who were denied the reserves during the historic treaty process. And then I have in here the circle here is Morrison Island, the place of the island Algonquins. I really like that map. We're still working on it a little bit. Thank you. So this map is the Royal Proclamation line. This one just, again, it just baffled me how this 45th parallel cut through our territory. And down here became common Indian hunting territory. This became, British and then French territory. And this map, I like it. It comes from Huduma, who unfortunately has passed away. I'm really sad about that. And this map is really useful in showing the Williams Treaty that was took away Algonquin land in 1923, and the Crawford Purchase took a little bit here, and then the Rideau Purchase of 1819. So this is a diagram which I created myself. A lot of people struggle with what is Indigenous knowledge, where is it, and who has it. And so what I did, this is one of my models of Indigenous knowledge. I think I have four of them. And what I did here is just I'm trying to teach people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, that Indigenous knowledge should not be essentialized into the language, for example, or into the land, or into our powwow regalia or into our ceremonies. Indigenous knowledge is in all places. It's in many places. So it's in the land and other beings. It's in our dreams and visions. It's in our language and symbolic literacy. It's in our communities, our elders, our traditional knowers. It's in the relationship between all these things. It's in our material culture. It's in our experiential knowledge. We have ways of making new knowledge. Our knowledge is not just in the past, and it's in our ceremonies. So the reason I make this is because I'm trying to teach people that Indigenous knowledge is not just rooted in the ceremonies, it is not just rooted in the language. Indigenous knowledge is in many places at the same time.
I think we have a short video here.
Miigwech.
So what is that? And that's the knowledge of the land and caring for the land. But it's not only that. It's how do we inscribe that knowledge into the landscapes of our bodies? As I said, when I was doing my PhD, I used heart knowledge and experiential knowledge and introspection. Those are traditional ways of knowing knowledge. But when I think hard about what is the difference between Indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge, I think that we have to keep in mind that when we raise our kids traditionally, our children traditionally, we teach them how to sing and how to dance and get that rhythm and how to pray. And, they have their special items and their regalia, and we feast with them and tell them stories. Before they even have a conscious understanding who they are as a person, the knowledge is already inscribed in in the landscape of their bodies. They already know how to pray to the Creator. They already know how to dance for the water, for example. And so as they grow up and they come into a conscious understanding of who they are, the knowledge is already there. And so when they're depressed or sad or excited or, grieving, when their mind fails them, their body will remember who they are. And so that's the gift of Indigenous knowledge. That is the gift.
I'm telling you, Ben, I have a lot of gratitude
And caring for the land.
that
Okay.
that's,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say I have a lot of gratitude that that's the knowledge I'm going to walk out the Western doorway with.
Yeah. So I think we're ready to see if the audience has some questions. I'm going to take a look at the chat here, see what we can see. So I'll start with one question, Lynn. That's a request for you to talk about the Algonquin Anishinaabe culture, such as the clan system, wampum diplomacy, and the sacred pipe.
Yeah, so the clan system is always, people are always wondering and pondering that, and certainly I did too. One thing I think about is that the Wendat had a clan system, the Haudenosaunee had a clan system. So based on that, I'm going to go with pretty sure we had a clan system, but I can't definitively say that. But what I have done a lot of reading about the clan system, and what I think is really important about that is that it regulated exogamic it was an exogamic regulation, meaning it was a way of ensuring blood diversity, that you didn't have children with other people of your clan. Now clan fell down the father line, and so anyways, that's something to think about. There's a lot there to think about. Now, I think with Pequawkanagan, a lot of people think they're Bear Clan because of that symbol of the bear. And I don't know if it is, but I often think that that symbol represents the bear, because the bear is our closest relative, right? For the Anishinaabe people, the bear is the closest thing to who we are. But also, we had an ancestor named Makwa, so maybe it's after Makwa. But today, what's happening is, well, if you look to the Ojibwa, for example, they have a lot of more, I guess, dense or broader discussion of what the clan system is, and I like what they have to say about it as a form of governance, that each clan had a specialty. It's debated whether people want to use a clan. My clan is a turtle clan. I like it. It works for me. It helps me live a good life. And so, if somebody has a clan and it's working for them, I wouldn't suggest that we argue about that.
So here's a question that we didn't get to, but it sounds like we're ready to get to it. We have somebody who wants us to talk about the significance of the Chaudière Falls, and we've talked about them as Pipe Bowl Falls, and we've talked about the fact that Chief William Commanda had urged that they be preserved and honored. as our nation's potential heart of reconciliation. So can you talk a little bit about the significance of Akikpotuk?
Akipuktuk, a very significant place. I call it a holy land, Algonquin Holy Land. Unfortunately, it was dammed during the lumber industry. But if you look at the ancient art, you can actually see the pipe in the landscape. So, as I said, Indigenous people, Algonquin people, we had a system of symbolic literacy. And one of them was we inscribed our stories in the landscape. And William Commander was a holder of the knowledge of Chaudière Falls / Akapuktuk, a very, very holy place.
You described to me the falls as the bowl and then channels leading out as the stem of the pipe.
Yeah, so that would depend on the flood, like how the waters were flowing. And so sometimes you wouldn't really see the pipe stem. Interestingly enough, though, I've come to think of it as there's two pipe stems. There's a articulated pipe and there's a disarticulated pipe. So underground, there's a underground pathway, which I've come to understand and know as another pipe.
So
Another stem of the pipe, rather.
Yeah.
And yeah.
We've certainly had people comment that they'd like to read your books, but also looking for any other recommendations. Now, in the chat, you left a lot of links for additional references, didn't you?
Yes, yes. Actually, I'm offering, if people want to buy my books, I'm selling them for a book bundle for $100, and that includes shipping.
Within Canada.
Within Canada, yes, within Canada.
Lynn, that's an amazing deal. If people really want some books to read and think about and make themselves think, I definitely recommend that they visit your website and take you up on that offer. You intrigue people with your talk about Indigenous knowledge. They want to know more. Who has it? Where is it? What does it offer us here in these times?
Yeah, so as I said, Indigenous knowledge is everywhere. It's not just in one place. When I was learning about Debwewan Mikancha Chigawing, I was learning the stories, I was learning the scrolls, I was learning the language. So it's in many places at the same time. Petroglyph Park, here in north of Peterborough, that's a source of Indigenous knowledge. But I would say that everybody has Indigenous knowledge. They just have to go back to their own Indigenous knowledge, right? Because Canada's not going to sustain you. Nationalism, the veneer of nationalism is too thin and it won't sustain you when you most need it. You have to go back to your ancient teachings, your ancient knowledge, your ancient regalia, your ancient foods. Everybody has Indigenous knowledge. And as I encourage people to go back to their Indigenous knowledge, that doesn't mean I'm opening the door for pretendians to take my Indigenous knowledge or to shape my Indigenous knowledge.
I have a question about something called the bowl with two spoons. Is that something you're familiar with?
No
Okay.
comment.
Okay.
But that is it's an important treaty.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lots of great comments about the presentation tonight, and questions about, is this being recorded? Yes, it is being recorded. It's going to be on our website for people to learn from and to share. Yeah, lots of great comments from folks. Just don't know.
Did I say anything wrong
there? Okay, here's one more question. What would you say regarding this time in humanity? Do you have any suggestions on how we, people raised in colonial, patriarchal, capitalist households, can move past this inherent societal sickness? As someone who's not Indigenous but grieves often for the land and emphasizes greatly with the history of Turtle Island and the painful history of colonialism and the damages and effects of our spirits, what are your thoughts on how we can bolster and uplift, both settler, sorry, well, how can we uplift Indigenous while not wanting to culturally appropriate your culture?
Well, that's such a loaded question. I want to say two things. I want to talk about the economic paradigm and I want to talk about morality. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So, in Anishinaabe people, we have this beautiful teaching about the human spirit, that the human spirit enters into the body through the heart. I imagine after conception. And I'm a scientist, so I struggled with that one. But then I went, okay, I could go with that. That's a great belief because I see the heart is probably the first organ to work. So I've come to understand, okay, so that's the teaching that the human spirit moves through the heart. And I've come to understand that morality takes the same pathway and it's right after the human spirit. It comes through the heart, moves through the heart. So, when I was dealing with the Department of Justice, one of the things that I really struggled with was the lack of morality and legal positivism. It's like they take out morality and toss it to the ground and then trash Lynn Gehl, call her all kinds of names and make her go through a legal maze for whatever, 20, 25 years. And sadly, they were women. They weren't even men, but the judges were men. So I think about that legal positivism as a methodology, how problematic it is. It's really narrow. It's not really where truth is. And I would say the same thing as scientific knowledge. When I was working in the lab, I was able to learn a lot of knowledge, but it wasn't changing human behavior. So how do we change human behavior is really something to think about. So think about that morals move through the heart. The other thing I want to talk about is economics. Algonquin people, we did have an economic system, contrary to what is said. Today, humans don't live in a culture. We predominantly are shaped and guided by the economic paradigm. The problem with the economic paradigm is it has no morals. It has no morals. So really think about mastering the economic paradigm where you can still be moral. How can you serve and uplift in Algonquin people, Indigenous people, stand beside them or stand behind them, pushing them forward. Don't stand in front of them. Make room for them. I can't believe I used to go to so many elders conferences and the white people would crowd around the elder. And it used to annoy me. It's like, why don't you open the doorway for me to come and meet the elder instead of crowding around them like that? They were like, I couldn't believe that I had to say to settler people, why don't you let us go first, and when you go to a powwow, it's not just there for your entertainment. Bring a couple of $100 and spend it, right? If you see somebody doing a great dance that you really enjoyed, a young woman, a young boy, give them money. If you see a young child that, maybe they need some regalia, give them money, but shop from the vendors. Shop from the vendors that have children sitting on their laps. So don't go to these powwows and assume, okay, I spent $10 to get in, I've done my deed. No, bring a couple $100 and spend it. If you want to, you can also leave your home and your land to me. My name is Lynn Gehl. I'll gladly accept any inheritance that comes my way, and you can be sure I'll do good things with it. Um, Purchase art and items from Indigenous crafters, buy our books, read our books, talk about our books, have book clubs, clubs and clubs. I'm a speaker, a professional speaker. I don't get enough gigs, so I would love the opportunity to speak more.
And all that information's on your website. Just Google Lynn Gehl and it all comes up.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the screen. First of all, I'm watching all these hearts float across the screen, which is fantastic. And I'm just looking at all the thank yous and miigwetches and talking about your selfless dedication and new knowledge and understanding and a whole bunch of appreciative people tonight. I see one more difficult question I'm going to ask you. Do you think identity can be complex rather than binary? How do we distinguish between fraud and fractured belonging? That's a tricky question.
Yeah, that is really difficult. And I can only tell you my story that it was as I was learning and walking into more deeply in a cognitive sense who I was as an Algonquin, because I certainly was living the embodied knowledge of being an Algonquin person. I had to do some hard reasoning, and I learned some hard lessons that as I moved forward claiming my Algonquin identity, I had to serve. I had to serve. And I have served. You know, Gale versus Canada was a 30-year effort. An insider analysis of the land claim process was not an easy effort. So if your identity is marginal, move into a position of serving.
All of this you're doing is not for yourself. It's you as an example of what needs to be fixed.
I'm doing it because suicide wasn't an option.
Mm. Well, I want to say thank you. And Miigwech, do you have anything else you wanted to add tonight, Lynn? I think you've said it all.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity. I wanted to say thank you to Jacob and Sherry, I think, and Ben. I also want to say thank you to Leona for speaking up and doing her best to get an Algonquin speaker tonight. And even Sonia, I think, who is with
Yeah,
USI.
absolutely.
Yeah,
She'll appreciate that call.
yeah. And of course, my husband, Nick.
Okay. Scheherazade, do you want to wrap up tonight?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much again, Dr. Gehl, and thank you so much, Ben. Thank you everyone who came tonight. Just a reminder, our next presentation is on February 23rd at 1 p.m. At the main branch of the OPL. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.